Okay, so hello everyone and welcome. Today I'm delighted to introduce you to Dr. Segun Aroyehun, who's been collaborating with us in Bristol for a long time. Segun is a postdoctoral researcher in natural language processing at the Social Data Science Group led by Professor David Garcia at the University of Konstanz. His research lies at the intersection between natural language processing and deep learning, and his primary focus is on developing approaches to prevent, detect, and counter misinformation, especially on social media. Today he's going to present his most recent findings from an historical computational analysis of Congress and parliamentary speeches from the US, Germany, and Italy, showing the relationship between evidence versus intuition-based perspectives of truth, and the correlation with this with political developments in those three countries. So thank you very much, Segun. Thank you very much, everyone. I'll leave it to you.
Okay, thanks, Fabio. I try to share my screen. Does it work?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, but then it's okay. Yeah, so as I need to move this away. Sorry. Okay. So as Fabio rightly mentioned, so I'll talk about the conceptions of truth, and this is a comparative study of three Western democracies, the US, Germany, and Italy, and this builds on Steve's talk last week. So this is more or less an extension of our recent work that was focused on the US, and the starting point for us is that, broadly speaking, there could be two perspectives to the conception, which Steve calls here ontologies of truth in code, which is one perspective or one way to look at truth, as whether it is based on evidence that relies on veracity and truth-seeking is the goal, and intuition-based perspective that relies on feelings, intuition, and somewhat authenticity. And to be clear, these two ontologies, we consider them to be endpoints on a continuum. And we will look at the operationalization of that. So this is also very widely connected to ideas where many scholars have written about post-truth and post-fact era. And one gap that we did find is that while there are several work on this, there is very little that has actually looked at this trend over a long period of time. And that's the gap we are trying to fill in the kind of work that we do. And recently we did look at the US Congress, and in fact, what we did find is that there was, as the title of the paper that you see on the screen shows, that there is a shift from evidence to intuition in the US. And we looked at other indicators as well, inequality and polarization. And this is the exact departure point for us, because it is natural to then ask the question, what is the case in other countries beyond the US? And that's exactly the idea of the exercise of this current work. So the central question is that if we observe a shift from evidence-based to intuition-driven discourse in the US, is there a similar shift also in Italy and in Germany, two additional case studies? And that's our goal here. And Italy and Germany are two important case studies because one, of course, they represent two different historical and political contexts from the US, and also because both countries have also experienced autocratic regimes, and they've had transitions from autocracy to democracy. So it will be interesting for us to see what the trend looks like across these political periods. Also importantly, both countries share a history of multi-party system, which is different from the US, which has a strong two-party system. And these factors that, as we will see later, may potentially explain the trends that we'll see. So this is the central question. In terms of our empirical approach, as we did for the US, so we rely on data sources, which are the parliamentary speeches, the transcript of parliamentary speeches over a long period of time. For Italy, we looked at speeches from 1861, record of speeches from 1861 to 2022. For Germany, from late 1970, from 1871 to 2021, and for the US, we still look at the data from our previous work from 1879 to 2022. And in addition to this, we also rely on an index from VDEM, which is the Deliberative Democracy Index. That's data that goes from 1900 till date. So the Deliberative Democracy Index, it's an estimate which is given by experts on the extent to which a country's political system fosters reasoned deliberation in their decision-making process. And the expectation is that this should give us some additional context as to the trajectory of these three countries. So I will the Deliberative Democracy Index is not a measure of the linguistic content, but our measure depends on the expression. I mean, the linguistic content of what is said of parliaments in these three countries. Nevertheless, we expect that at least we should pick up something, as we will see later on. That's the expectation. So in terms of a bit of methodology, so the way we will extract measures from the text will be to rely on dictionaries, which we have built for English, and then adapted to the case of Germany and Italy, thanks to Fabio and Christoph, because of course I don't speak these two languages, but they do. So we started with the dictionaries in English, and then we adapted them to the German language and the English language. And all of the other things follow from there. And from these dictionaries, of course, we also validated these dictionaries. We then use this dictionary to compute evidence-based score and intuition-based scores based on this approach called the distributed dictionary representation, which basically relies on the cosine similarity between the representation of the dictionary to the representation of a text. So by representation of a dictionary here, I mean we looked at the word embeddings for the word embeddings for each word in the dictionary. Then we take the average of that. That gives us a dictionary representation. And for any given piece of text, we also looked at each of the words, the content was in those in any piece of text, and then take the average of those content ones as a representation. And then we looked at the cosine similarity between these two, and this cosine similarity can range from -1, that is completely dissimilar, to +1, which is maximally similar in this case. And by the way, the word embeddings that we rely on here are also word embeddings that are trained on the corpus of interest here. So we use word embeddings that are trained on congressional speeches, the speeches from the Parliament of Italy, and also the speeches from the Parliament of Germany as well over time. What we then do is, I've shown here earlier on in the presentation, is to calculate the evidence minus intuition score, which is the difference between the Z transformation of the similarity to each of the dictionaries. So we have an evidence-based score and an intuition-based score. And the idea behind having a compound score is to look at the relative salience of evidence-based language to intuition-based language for any given piece of text. So we have the compound score, and later in the presentation, I will also show the individual scores, because probably it's also interesting to look at those individual scores. And that's a point of clarification, is to say that actually what we look here is to look at how the pursuit of truth is reflected in rhetoric. We are not really here interested in looking at the truth value of the statements that are in any of these corpora, because that's something totally different. So based on this, if I don't have any questions up until now, because I will then show what we found so far. So I will start with the case of the US. So here we looked at the trajectory of evidence-based language minus intuition-based language. And this in relation to the deliberative democracy index. And just as the plot I showed earlier on, the finding here is that post World War II, there is certainly a marked increase in the index, the DDI, and also increase in the EMI. So that's good news. So it's probably a reflection of democratic consolidation or reconstruction post-World War II, which is interesting. And then what we then see is that from the mid-70s, what we found in the US is a decline in evidence-based language, really, towards intuition. And we also see some gradation in terms of the deliberative democracy index. So this is probably the exception in this case. I will show the other two, but this is probably interesting to see that it's only in the US where we find this decline in the deliberative democracy index. For the other two countries, we will not see this. And it's also interesting in this case to realize that the decline in evidence-based language seems also to track these, especially in the as from the 2010s. That was when this sharp decline in the deliberative democracy index, and the EMI also goes that way. So this is most of the story of the US when it comes to looking at this spectrum of evidence minus intuition. What is also very interesting is to look at the different scores. So to look at the measure of evidence-based language and intuition-based language separately. So the EMI score, it's a compound score that looks at the difference between the two. So it's subtraction of evidence from intuition. But also it's interesting to look at the case of each of these separately. And what the trend that is visible is that prior to the 1940s, more or less evidence and intuition moves in the same direction. But after that, there is a clear separation in the trajectory of evidence-based language and intuition-based language, and that actually would see from the 1990s that there is a marked increase in intuition-based language and a substantial decrease in evidence-based language. So now I move on to Germany. which is another interesting case. So Germany, in terms of the EMI, we see that the evidence-based and intuition-based language more or less hovers around 0 up until the 1930s. And there we see a sharp decline in evidence-based language, which is also clearly marked by the deliberative democracy index as well. And the recovery, the rhetoric also matches the recovery of the deliberative democracy index. Only that the deliberative democracy index in the case of Germany, it's relatively stable and high, whereas the rhetoric is showing that there is a decline in evidence-based language over time. And especially there is this important to note in recent years that we see this sharp decline, 2013 to 2017, which is very highly connected to the rise of AFD and the pressures from right-wing populism, as it may be. So in because I did mention the political periods at the beginning, which is an interesting context. So in the case of Germany, there is the Reichstag, which was in place from 1871 to 1918, part of the Reichstag, which corresponds to the time of the empire, the German Empire. And then after the empire collapses, then we have the Weimar Republic, which lasted from 1913 to 1932, before we then had the reign of the Nazis. And then the Republic, which started from 1949. And what is interesting is to look at the way the trajectory, somewhat the trajectory of intuition-based language is from the empire to the Weimar Republic, and then all of a sudden the huge shifts during the period of the Nazis. Of course, it is important to also remark that the period of the Nazis rule have very little data, as you will probably see in the confidence interval. The confidence interval is larger, but nevertheless, the measures still show us that there is very little in terms of evidence-based language during that period of dictatorship, the autocratic regime. And since the 1949, when democracy has mostly, liberal democracy has mostly been stable, we see that the level of evidence-based language is quite high during that period. Now, we'll look at a similar plot now, looking at the individual measures of evidence and intuition, to look at the trajectory of that as well. And what is immediately noticeable also is that there is also a sharp decline in evidence-based language, especially, the decline started from the period of the Weimar Republic, that's from 1913 or so. And there is this sharp decline during the period of the Nazi rule, which reflects what we saw in the previous plot, but it's still instructive to see these two separated, and to also see how that grew after the return to democracy. And from 1949, we see that the evidence-based language has been relatively higher than intuition-based language. And from the 1990s, the trajectory of both have been very similar, and also an important point is to also look at the recent years where there is this uptick in intuition-based language. So that's this story for Germany.
Segun, can I interrupt you a second?
Yes.
Like, is a technical reason why there is like a 16-year gap? Like we have, I think, 3/4 years, and then there's 1933, 1949. Like, do we have data missing in that period, or like how come that?
Yes. Especially during the period of the war, there's very little in terms of data during the period. But I mean, this periods that just designate when the so I said the point. The point is that, for example, in the 1933 case, it is not the case that we actually have a legislative session from 1933 to 1948, which I think answers your question. So there are some gaps. So there are gaps, periods where you don't have legislative sessions, or even the legislative session, even when they were in place, they had very little sittings because everything was decided by Hitler. So very few sittings took place, but at least there is still something for us to measure what is in the rhetoric during that period. Yeah, thanks for that question, for you. So the case of Italy. So in the case of Italy, what we also observe is so in the Italy also has this kingdom. The monarchy was in place until Mussolini took over, and then the transition to democracy. So and what we do know, at least what this plot shows us, is that the most of the reign of the kingdom, at least prior to 1920s, is from mostly we see more of intuition-based language than evidence-based language, and then we also see very minimal in terms of evidence-based language in the early 1920s. But from the mid-20s, there was at least this that shows us that there is an uptick in evidence-based language relative to intuition-based language. And this is a bit, if you compare this trend with the Deliberative Democracy Index, which here shows that there's very little going on in terms of deliberative democracy, but still we pick up this uptick in the use of evidence-based language relative to intuition-based language. I think I will probably leave this discussion to the next plot, because it really seems to be an interesting case in this. So very similarly, with respect to Germany, the rhetoric also tracks what experts measure as in terms of the Deliberative Democracy Index. So the rhetoric also picks up with more evidence-based language as the Deliberative Democracy Index increases, and we see that Italy actually, based on the Deliberative Democracy Index, has been relatively stable in terms of the institutional framework for policy decision making as assessed by experts. But nevertheless, the trajectory, the trend in terms of rhetoric, it's quite undulating a bit, but still relatively high in terms of mostly evidence-based language. So the individual scores then of evidence and intuition probably help us a bit to pass out what we saw previously, where we see that during the period of the fascists, which is from early 1920s to the 1930s, we observe this increase in evidence-based language relative to intuition-based language. Fabio, you have to correct me if I'm wrong here. And one of the reasons that that this is the case is that from our analysis of the speech and from reading a bit about the historical period, is that the fascists actually employ the legislative framework to enact laws to make the fascist way of life, to institutionalize the fascist way of life. That's the way to put it. And so they enact quite a lot of laws to make fascism a way of life. But it is only a matter of time. I mean, after putting those laws into place, that finally Mussolini had to be a dictator anyway, which was the game plan, one could imagine. And so that's why we observe that evidence-based language is actually a bit higher than intuition-based language during the period of fascism. Secondly, one could also observe that there is a dip in evidence-based and intuition-based language during this fascist period, which we've also investigated, and what we did find is that many of the records, the documents that we find during this period actually contain quite a lot of bureaucratic language that it barely expresses anything about evidence or intuition, so to say. And so this is one exception that we've found in this study, which we are trying to puzzle out. And the other thing that would be immediately visible is also the periods of 1945 and 1946, which has a very high level of intuition language, and that is also can be easily attributable to the fact that the two sessions in 1945 and 1946, the Constituent Assembly that were put in place to set up a constitution for the Republic. And in a way, the expectation is that perhaps the discussion during these two commissions that were supposed to draft the Constitution is likely going to be very, very intuition-based. I mean, it has to be about beliefs, it has to be about values, and very little in terms of what is evidence or verifiable fact or information, if anything, of that nature at all. And beyond that, probably what is a bit also different for the case of Italy is that in the current periods, we also see that evidence and intuition-based language also follow the same trajectory. And in this case, it's just a downward trajectory as well. But I must admit that this case of Italy, I don't know whether Fabio wants to add anything, but this case of Italy was a bit of a puzzle for us. So if anybody actually has further thoughts on what we observed, it will be very interesting to hear those thoughts. Fabio, you.
Well, no, we discussed about this. I think that the dip, like the decrease in the 30s, come from the fact that probably the parliamentary debates were only used to legiferate stuff. So it's very dull language that doesn't really contain anything. And it also says, I think, a bit about a problem about using the EMI, because when you look at the EMI, it seems there's a peak in evidence, but it's really not. It's just that the evidence goes down less than intuition, so there's no such peak. So, but yeah, as long as I don't know about the later years. Honestly, I'm curious to see whether something changes, like in the very last 2-3 years when we have the Meloni's government, if there is a peak, if there is an increase in intuition, I might have to scrape that data. But yeah, no, I don't have anything to add right now. Maybe we can discuss it later in the Q&A session.
Yeah, okay. Great. And so another way to also look at this a bit differently, just to drive home the point, is to look at the different political periods from the reign of the king, that's 1861 to the early 1920s, and then the period of fascism and the period of the consulta and the assembly, which are commissions that are put in place to draft the constitution, and then from there on, when there's this recovery from dictatorship, and one could see that yes, the EMI scores they reflect what one would expect, that you have more evidence-based language during the period of democratic rule. More intuition in the recovery phase from autocracy, and of course the fascist rule, which I did pointed out earlier on, seems to have a bit more evidence-based language than the period of the reign of the monarchy. Yes. So mostly when based on this results, there are certainly common threads that we can observe. That the fact that democratic breakdown, at least in the two cases that we've seen, correspond to decline in evidence-based language. And that's historically more noticeable for Germany, for example, compared to Italy. And recently, it's also visible in the case of the US. I showed a plot earlier on where it's only the exceptional case of the US where we see that the expert measure of deliberative democracy, it's only in the case of the US among the three cases that we saw that dropping actually. The rest of the two democracies are quite high and stable, even in the recent times. One other observation is that, yes, post-World War II, there's a rise in evidence-based language, and this somewhat also tracks the trend in the deliberative democracy index across both three cases. So it's a sign of democratic consolidation and reconstruction. Of course, it's an open question now whether when we see that evidence-based language is declining, could that also be a sign of democratic backsliding or sign of democratic erosion? That's an open question. But if anything that we know is that with the uptick in evidence-based language, yes, it's a signal that yes, the democracy is having a good health. Whether when it is declining, whether that's a measure of this, yeah, that's an open question that future study will have to disentangle. So Germany and Italy, they also have high and relatively stable DDI in recent years, with the exception of the US. And I will have to return to the case of the US because it's only in the case of the US where we see a clear separation in the trajectory of evidence-based and intuition-based language. Initially in the 70s is what evidence-based language, higher than intuition-based language. And then later on, they both crisscross. Now it is intuition-based language that is higher and evidence-based language that is lower. And that certainly can be attributable to many factors. I don't think these are exhaustive. One could be the fact that the US is a two-party system versus the case of Italy and Germany that are multi-party system, and they had to work. So there is probably a culture of building coalition, and that may actually also reflect in the language of the parliament of those two countries. The other factor could also certainly be related, as we've shown recently, the rising polarization and inequality could also be a factor. Populism, yes, and all of this, the Germany and Italy are also not exempt from the pressures from populism and inequality. Only that the data now suggests that it seems that this is more visible and more evident and more stark in the case of the US. And to also return to our paper, that actually this has implications for functioning of the democratic institution. For example, in the case of the US, I think Steve also showed this last week. We also find this link between the evidence-based language and the productivity of democratic institutions at the US Congress. So an interesting open question is also whether this link can be established for these two countries. Of course, we don't have the data. It will be interesting to also piece out and to look at the connection to the function of these democratic institutions. With that, I will return to the original research question, which is that is there a shift from evidence-based to intuition-driven discourse in Italy and Germany, similar to the trend observed in the US? The data that we have is telling us not quite. There are certainly differences, but with the data and the analysis so far doesn't tell us that that shift is there. And I will leave it here, and I'll be happy to take questions and comments, and happy to have further discussion about this so far. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's open the floor for questions.
Yeah, can I ask a question? Segun, about the not the Italian data, the German data. Can you break it down by party post World War II? Do you have access to that?
Yes, that can be done post World War II. We can break it down by party.
Because you mentioned the AFD, I think, at one point. It would be very good to see that, where that sits.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, I will.
Okay, thank you.
Alan.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. I was just wondering whether one possible kind of complicating factor here might be that the word's more likely to be kind of coded as kind of intuition-based rather than evidence-based, or the way of expressing your views that might be coded as intuition-based rather than evidence-based might also just be kind of less formal ways of speaking, such that we might expect a kind of rise in that kind of language just at points where, for example, if there's an election with a big turnover of kind of new representatives coming in who are kind of just less professionalized, like haven't just kind of grown up knowing the political discourse and kind of speaking in a kind of very formal language, or just as kind of representative bodies become more representative of populations in terms of kind of class and things like that, whether that would be something that you could track alongside the use of different languages in case that's complicating things in a way that isn't necessarily anything to do with levels of kind of the democratic indexes. So anyway, I wondered if that was, without being able to see like what words were coded as intuition-based rather than evidence-based, I wonder if that was a possible complicating factor that might be interesting to measure as well, or what you thought about that.
It's an interesting question. Though I will have to think a bit about it. But one thing I will probably also say that could be in the opposite direction to this, is that what one will expect is that if the speeches in these deliberative bodies are also meant to be formal in a way, in principle, because they are supposed to follow certain procedures and ways of addressing each other and also in that regard. So whether the speeches then becomes less formal, it's an interesting question to test. Although I will think a bit differently, because we have also done this kind of thing with the US Congress, where we looked at measures on Twitter, for example, which by design, it's not a formal setting, and measures on comments. And in that situation, what we found is that there is a correlation actually between these two measures. So what we pick up on Twitter, we also pick up for the same person speaking on the floor of the Congress. So I would tend to err on the side of that this is a communication style. It's whether you speak in a formal setting or in an informal setting, that sort of ontology sticks. That's at least we know this for a fact for the US. But it's a very interesting question.
So I think my thought was, I know after kind of one of the elections here where there's a large influx of SNP MPs in Westminster, it was quite common for them to be getting kind of called up by the speaker because they weren't addressing in the kind of appropriate way, just because, you know, they were kind of a new influx of MPs that hadn't been there before, and it took a while for that to kind of settle down. I just wondered if kind of new MPs that, or in other places that were kind of less inhibited by the kind of status quo way of talking, might be more willing to bring in informal language into their speeches in a way that wouldn't have been done previously. But anyway, that was one thing that I wanted to ask. Thank you very much for your talk.
Thanks.
Gordon.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, so this is all really interesting. I had two quite closely related questions. Well, perhaps the first is rather an observation. So then the observation is that looking at these graphs and similar ones from other talks, I'm struck by a bit of a parallel between the trend in various indices of social capital, which is a thing we've been looking at quite a lot here, and the similarities of those trends to the kind of increases in evidence-based language, relatively anyway, that you see from about 1945 to usually about 1970 or 75 or so, if I'm remembering correctly. So that's pretty much what you see, if I recall correctly, in the US anyway, with indices of social capital, which are to do with strength of local community and participation in voluntary organizations and things like that. So I guess the first part of the question could be whether you think there might be some interesting relationship there. And the second part of the question is, suppose instead of coding all the language in terms of whether it's evidence-based or intuition-based and belief stating and so on, one coded all the language in terms of whether it was signaling people's group membership and social identities and so on, or whether it wasn't. How similar would the graphs look, would you think, if one had a classification like that?
Yeah, to the second point, the answer is I actually don't know. But it's interesting because one can certainly look at references to in-group and out-group as a proxy for whether you're signaling future identities. But I don't know what that measure will give. Certainly, it's a very interesting question, by the way.
Can I make a comment on that? I mean, thanks, Gordon. Yeah, it's a very good idea to look at identity-based stuff, except we don't have, the facility to do that at the moment. We don't have a dictionary or anything else. The social capital issue is also an interesting one, and we have a partial answer to that, I suppose, in the polarization data from the Congress. And that, as you know, is a proxy for all sorts of things and is, negatively correlated with social capital and the relationship between EMI and polarization is incredibly strong. So I would expect there on that basis also to be a very strong correlation between EMI and these various indices of social capital. And I entirely agree. I think that would be a really good addition to the battery of things to look at, because it is, it speaks to the welfare of society. And what we find with Congress is that the EMI gives us an indication of the welfare of society, at least, quarterly, by looking at polarization.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then the kind of interesting question to us is, well, is it something like social capital, or is it inequality, or is it something else that somehow sits higher than those two, which is the kind of ultimate causal factor that perhaps influences all these other things? I mean, one thing we're finding is that in predicting conspicuous consumption, which is a kind of index of individualism and materialism and that kind of thing, it's predicted quite independently by social capital and by inequality, right? And about equally strongly. And slightly to my surprise, there isn't actually any interaction. So that's just agreeing with you, really. I think if you added social capital to your plots, which you certainly could for the USA, where we have quite good evidence of the time trends, yeah, I think it would, as you say, look pretty similar to polarization. So an interesting thing is that the indices of social capital seem to reach their peak maybe 5 or 10 years earlier than the time at which income inequality starts really increasing, which more like about 1980 in the US and the UK anyway. And your graphs on the language here seem to peak a bit earlier than the inequality, I think, but I can't remember.
Yeah, well, they do. In fact, we know that statistically. Segun, correct me if I'm wrong, but the EMI, the association between EMI and inequality is lagged by one session of Congress, isn't it? It's the previous Congress 3 years ago that predicts inequality now, which makes perfect sense if you think of, how long it takes for a law to make a difference to inequality. But of course, social capital may respond much more quickly than inequality to the same thing.
It could. It would depend on the index, I think. Yeah. This would be well worth.
Yeah, I think you're right. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Konstantinos.
Hi, thank you, Segun, for the great talk. So just an idea about, in the same vein that Steve talked about earlier about separating the parties. I was wondering, so if I understand correctly, all of the data that you have are like political speeches and Congress talks and stuff like that. But I was wondering if you had any kind of access to journalistic text.
Oh,
No.
Okay, because I'm thinking that this could be an interesting point of comparison between political and journalistic speech. But yeah, then maybe for a next project.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
I mean, we do have access. I mean, we do have the New York Times, for example, 500,000 articles or something over time, which we could look at. We do have access to a few corpora. And we've also looked at for the Twitter study where we looked at tweets by members of Congress, we also looked at the text of the news articles they were linking to. And we find, a relationship between what they say in their tweets and what's in the text in terms of an association between belief speaking and misinformation. So we've kind of scratched the surface on this, but you're right. I think there's a whole battery of analyses that could be done with that. Absolutely. Unfortunately, it turns out that actually getting the data into shape is extremely time consuming and tedious, as Segun and Fabio will be able to tell you. Just extracting those speeches sounds really easy, but it's not. You're talking about early 20th century typewritten stuff that's been scanned into a PDF, and then you use OCR on that, and what you get back is pretty dodgy. So that's why a lot of this is actually a huge effort.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
Christoph has his hand up, I think.
Yes, thank you. Just one quick question. I'm wondering, since we already can correlate the language-based indicators for evidence language and the associated correlation with democratic backsliding, from a procedural perspective, language should come before institutional decline, right? So I wonder how long that gap should be. So can we actually say, for example, 5 years prior before VDEM or whatever other indice we have captures the erosion of democratic institutions, we can already see that decline in the language-based indicators. Do we have an idea how long that period or interval is?
No, not at all.
But Segun, that's easily obtainable by doing the lag regressions the same way you did it for the Congress.
Yes, I can attempt that.
Yeah,
Measure
it's a very good question, because indeed one of the objectives of doing this in the first place was to seek linguistic indicators that are precursors to a democratic decline. And so I think your question, Christoph, is absolutely crucial, because the goal here is to have an early warning system, in a sense. And doing that lag analysis would answer that.
And that's an incredibly powerful message, right? If we can think about, look, our data shows 2 years ahead of substantial, significant decline of certain democratic institutions is preceded by this change in language. I mean, how more powerful can it be?
Yeah, well, precisely. That was the goal. And indeed, yes. So, Segun, go for it. Burn the crack.
Fix the problem.
Yeah, we'll see what the data tells us. I'm taking notes.
You can do it.
Yeah.
But first, you got to revise the Congress paper, which
Yes, that's
so we can send it back to Nature Human Behavior and get it out.
hopefully soon.
Yes, very good. Well, thanks, Segun, and thanks, everybody. I think we can wrap it up.
Yes.
I've got other stuff to run too. So it's good to see you all. And next week, same place.
Well, no, next week is actually on Friday. And if
Oh, of
now-
course,
yes.
with Jay Van Babel. That's right. Yes.
There will be an
Yes.
invite out, but it's on Friday 2:30 UK time, and with it's a joint meeting with Jay Van Babel's New York University. I guess.
Yeah, NYU. Yeah, so we have to move it back to cover the time zones. And yeah, very good. So anyway, see you next Friday.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Yeah, ciao. All right, very good. I gotta run. You got my Discord?
Probably I